So we're doing Martin Luther Part 2 tonight. If you missed Part 1, we're going to put out both of the recordings tomorrow. But the grand takeaway for the first half of Martin Luther's life is, well, two. It's that he never intended to break away from the Catholic Church. He just wanted to have a dialogue, and they said no and kicked him out. And the second thing is that the 95 Theses were an inherently pro-Pope document. He firmly believed that if the Pope knew what was actually happening, that he would side with him. It was very complimentary of the Pope, but the Pope thought it caused too much of a racket. And as we talked about, he posted it just to talk to his friends on the faculty. Somebody else, without his consent, took it, translated it into German, and then mass printed it, and it went all over Europe. So he never intended to kind of start the Protestant Reformation. Some say it happened by accident. Others think maybe it was a little more divine plan happening there, but wasn't Martin Luther's intended purpose. So last week we ended with his "Here I Stand" speech at what's called the Diet of Worms. So remember, diet means meeting. Worms is just the name of the city in what is now Germany. It's probably closer to like Worms, but we pronounce it different in the English. So he delivered the "Here I Stand" speech, where he was called to come by himself with no representation in front of the entire kind of upper ruling class of the Catholic Church and basically recant. And he said, "Here I stand, unless you give me a reason, an argument against my argument. I simply cannot just say I was wrong. I would like something else. So here I stand," right? So he did that in full knowledge of the fact that, like hundreds before him, he probably was going to be arrested and burnt at the stake and died. He walked outside expecting to be seized by the magistrate, burned at the stake, expecting to die. He came out to a standing ovation from all of his followers who were outside praying that he would have the will to not recant, to stand up to the Catholic Church. And as he was waving to the people and kind of exhaling, a wagon with cloaked men came riding through the crowd, and they grabbed him and threw him in the back of the wagon, and he disappeared out of town. And later in his memoirs, he writes that he thought, "Man, that was fast. I didn't think they would come for me this quickly." He thought for sure his executioners were here and that this would be the end of his run. But as they continue to ride farther out of town, he notices that all of his books from his office at the university were in the back of this wagon. He starts to see more and more of his personal effects until he realizes that the entirety of his office from the university is inside of this wagon with him, and that the men driving the wagon were his friends from the college who were smuggling him out before the powers that be could get him. So they snuck him out. He went to Thuringia, which is outside of Saxony. Saxony was the kingdom that he lived in. Outside of it, to a place called Wartburg Castle. So this is a weird season of life for him because he assumed an alias. He went by Squire George for about a year. He grew out a beard. He carried a sword. He was just kind of a weird passerby in the Thuringia area. He was often seen at the alehouses having deep conversations with people about life. But it seems, from what we understand about history, that no one there knew that he was Martin Luther. They thought he was this odd guy named Squire George. So he stayed in the castle for months until everything kind of died down. And by that point, he had grown a beard. He had grown out his hair, because remember, he was a monk until this point. And so he had a certain haircut, a certain clean-shaven look about him. He looked almost unrecognizable. And so he lived peaceably there in Thuringia for quite a long while. And this is when he started the process of translating the Bible into German, out of Latin into the language of the people, which is something that the second half of his career would be largely based on, is this idea of making the Bible accessible to everyone, not just to the educated, not just to the clergy, but personal Bible study and personal availability of Scripture. So he did this for a while, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. He eluded spies that were all around, that were looking for Martin Luther. They were looking for him all over the place, and he lived peaceably. But then something started to happen back in Wittenberg, where he was from. These guys, which we need to be careful because there's several groups who go by the title of radical reformers during this time period, but there was a group back in Saxony. They were using Martin Luther's name and the momentum of his movement to incite riots and to vandalize church property. They were saying, if you're with me and if you're with Martin Luther, let's go burn this church down. If you're with us, and by us, I'm strongly implying Martin Luther, let's go rob these monks. Let's go rob these priests. Let's stick it to the powers at be. Remember, we talked about in the first time how his dad was part of an emerging middle class, that he was an entrepreneur, and he really had this vision of the common people making a life for themselves. So the poor in Saxony rallied around Martin Luther. The problem was he wasn't actually there to lead them. It was kind of the legend, the myth of Martin Luther. And so he didn't like what was being done in his name. And so he left the security and the safety of his assumed identity and kind of in an exciting story in the middle of the night took off. He didn't tell the people who were hiding him. He didn't tell the people who knew where he was. He didn't tell any of his advisors. He hopped on a horse and just rode straight through the night back to Wittenberg. So he shows back up where he is highly wanted, simply to reclaim his name. The kind of straight out of a movie scene happens where he walks into a meeting where these reformers are talking about their next kind of riot. And he walks in again, still brandishing a sword, still with a big beard, looks nothing like Martin Luther. And they say, "Excuse me, who are you?" He said, "My name is Martin Luther." And they kind of stopped and looked at him. And they said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "I want my pulpit." He returned to do a teaching and a preaching ministry where God had called him, and to kind of reclaim his name and the momentum of all of this. He would go on. There would be a war in the coming years in Saxony. They would call it like the uprising of the peasants. And both sides thought that Martin Luther would side for them. The ruling class said, surely he'll use his influence to tell the poor that they're out of line. And the poor said, surely he'll use his influence to tell the rich that their time has come. And really, he still gets flack about this from a lot of historians, but he chastised both sides. And he told them, you have to change your ways or something's going to happen. And kind of a prophetic voice, he predicted what would be called the 30 Years' War. That would happen 100 years later. And these two sides never really came together. So he's in the middle of kind of all of this craziness. We need to remember that for the rest of this lesson, he's still wanted by the powers that be. He still, though he moves around quite a bit and speaks and writes, he could, at any point, they could seize him and kill him. So in the middle of all of this, he meets 9 nuns. So there were 9 nuns in Wittenberg who were excommunicated because they followed Luther's teachings. They said, we agree with what was circulated. There's a lot of problems going on here. So he took it upon themselves to integrate them into the culture and into the kind of the town of Wittenberg. And how that would work in the 1500s is that respectable adult women find respectable husbands. And so Martin Luther took upon himself the task of being a matchmaker for these 9 nuns. He found 8 of the 9 nuns husbands relatively quickly. Respectable Christian men in the society, many of them wealthy. He really did right by most of these nuns who stepped out on faith by his words. But there was one nun, Katharina, who was very outspoken, who was didn't fit kind of the model of what would be considered ladylike in the 1500s because she spoke her mind, because she was kind of sarcastic. And he really had a hard time finding her a match. 2 separate times he thought he had finally done it. He went to her and he said, I've talked to this nobleman. I've set it all up. This is great. I mean, he's wealthy. He has land. He's a good man. And she basically just said, nope, not going to do it. None of the other nuns had really said no. They'd said, oh, thank you for lining this up. And so he was about at his wit's end with the woman he would go on to call Kathy. And finally, one day he said, well, what do you want? And she said, well, I'd marry you. And he thought, that's an interesting proposal to how we're going to fix this whole problem. It wasn't that he was opposed to marriage. He figured since his time leaving the church that at some point maybe he would, except he thought he would make a horrible husband because any day the authorities were going to come in and kill him. And so after some conversations and some convincing, he decided, sure. And so he married Kathy, as he would go on to call her, and a small secret wedding, and then wrote home to his family. He wrote home and saying his first line to his family was, in line with what Father has always wanted for me, I write you to tell you that I have married. And so he was married. He started to have kids and write a lot of letters to friends. And this is where we get to see a lot of kind of the personality and the wit of Martin Luther. So from his letters to his friends, we get to see into his life a little bit. He writes a letter to his close friends about the upcoming birth of his son Hans. He says, my Katie is fulfilling Genesis 1:28. There is to be a child born to a monk and a nun. That was his kind of sense of humor. He constantly brought up the fact that she was a nun and he was a monk, and yet now they were both married and they were having children. Later in a letter to his friends, when he started talking about his firstborn son, Hans, who was named after his father, cutting teeth, he says, these are the joys of marriage to which the Pope is not worthy. Later, when he talks about Hans constantly crying, he says, this is the sort of thing that caused the church fathers to vilify marriage. So we see in his kind of early fatherhood years, a lot of the wit of Martin Luther, of why he became such a followed person. He had a really sharp wit to him, would be considered sarcastic by today's standards, but was always very witty and sharp. He would go on over the next, I think, 8 or 9 years to have 6 children with his wife, 3 boys, 3 girls. Unfortunately, 4 of his 6 children passed before the age of 36. 3 of them passing in childhood and in adolescence age, and then 1 of them passing in their 30s. Only 2 of them, both boys, lived to be adults into their actual careers. Hans, his firstborn, being one of them. So we get kind of family life Luther. It's a different picture, I think, than what we usually think about him in church history, but he starts to really write some important works here, but he's juggling life. So he's married, he's got kids. He still is every single day just waiting for the day that the authorities show up and kill him because he's causing all sorts of problems. But in 1525, the year he got married, he started his work on one of his most important books called The Bondage of the Will. So this is an important work for the traditions within the Christian faith who believe in predestination. Luther played off of Augustine, and later Calvin used a lot of what Luther wrote. So Dr. Bruce Gore, who's a church historian, he says that Luther was a Calvinist, or rather Calvin was a Lutheran, because when he wrote this, John Calvin was only 16, right? So often we think predestination, we think John Calvin, but John Calvin, the bondage of the will from 1525 was very formative for John Calvin. So today, Lutheran churches have largely moved away from the doctrine of predestination. It's not as synonymous with Lutherans, it's synonymous with Calvinist churches. But Luther in 1525 wrote maybe the most important book on predestination that we have, in the middle of getting married and in the middle of hiding from the authorities and kind of reclaiming his name. He also, during this time period, wrote many, many, many hymns Probably the only one that we know of and the average person knows of in modern times is "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." He wrote that in 1529, likely in the middle of another one of these territorial wars where he saw what was happening around him. So he wrote a lot of hymns, he wrote a lot of books, he did a lot of research, and he was kind of a family man just living back in Wittenberg, an existence he never thought that he would have after his Diet of the Worms speech. So in 1529, that same year, he wrote "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Something called the Colloquy of Marburg happened. So why this is important? Because basically it was a meeting. He was the head of what's called by us now the German Reformation. Then there was this guy who we'll talk about next week. He's probably my favorite person in all of church history. His name is Ulrich Zwingli. He was the head of what's called the Swiss Reformation, right? They decided, let's have a meeting, let's talk. And if we are of one like mind, we can kind of work together. We can start to do things together. We can use each other as a resource. We can really start to get the ball rolling on the Protestant Reformation. Remember, so we're about 12 years past the 95 Theses. So it still has not been a lot of time that this movement's been coming around. They came to the table with 15 points that they thought were very important to agree upon. They had meetings and meetings and meetings, and they talked, they discussed, they debated. And at the end of it, they said, we agree on 14 of the 15. And because we do not agree on all of them, we are fans of each other, we are well-wishers of each other, but we will not join together and kind of go forward as one unity. For me, this is one of the biggest tragedies of church history. If Luther and Zwingli could have brought their movements together, and Zwingli's Swiss Reformation movement would be taken over by John Calvin in probably just 15, 20 years from this point. If those two could have come together, it would have kind of rewrote the history book of what we have going forward. But they would continue to be separate parallel movements going forward because of communion. Communion was the one thing they could not agree upon. And since Luther was such an adamant believer in his stance on communion, they walked away from Marburg as still two groups. Although fond of each other, although supportive of each other, would not formally unite. So why was communion so important? So Luther did not coin the phrase consubstantiation. This was brought on at a later date, but he did preach that transubstantiation, which is a really long word for the Catholics believed that the bread and the wine physically became the body and the blood of Christ. That's transforming of the substance, right? That's what the Catholics believed. Luther preached that he thought that that was too heavily impacted by superstition and kind of mysticism and tradition. So he said that rather Christ was somehow present in the elements and of the practice. So the word consubstantiation comes in, that it's the same substance. The substance of Christ is at work, but it's not this mystical transformation. If you remember last time we talked about his first ever mass as a priest, he got to the line "Hoc est corpus meum," which means "this is my body." And the thought that the bread physically turned into the flesh of Christ was so overwhelming for him that he just stopped, froze, and had to be walked through the rest of communion by a more elder priest. So this was what Luther believed. This is still largely what the Lutheran faith and other ones believe in still to this day, is consubstantiation. Zwingli, on the other hand, he believed in what we call the memorial view of it. He believed that it was done purely in memory of Christ, right? Most communion tables, especially Baptist churches, in the front say something along the lines of "do this in remembrance of me," or "in remembrance, do this." Where two or more are gathered, God is there already. That was his thought process, right? That's scriptural. So the ordinance, again, most churches who follow Zwingli's model call it an ordinance and not a sacrament. The ordinance of communion was meant simply to serve as a reminder for the people. So unfortunately, it's this difference between Christ being somehow present and it being an act of memorial this difference over communion is why the Swiss and the German Reformations did not merge. There are some theologians and historians who believe that if Luther and Calvin were more of contemporaries, that they would have merged together, that Zwingli and Luther didn't see eye to eye, but Calvin and Luther would have seen more eye to eye and probably merged together if Calvin was 15, 20 years older. But they head forward. Next week, we'll talk about the Swiss Reformation and Ulrich Zwingli. But so they head forward for the rest of his life, basically. Just this is the German Reformation. He starts to write a lot about the Jewish faith, Judaism, in this period of his life. And a lot of these writings have been taken out of context. And now a lot of church historians are having to do the work of trying to answer whether Martin Luther was an anti-Semite. Nobody in his time period saw him as an anti-Semite. The problem is that in the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler saw him as a great German mind and started to quote Martin Luther to justify his hatred of the Jews. And so in the church in the West, they said, oh, Martin Luther, Hitler, their names started to kind of mix in together in ways that are not helpful, right? So this led to many people believing that Martin Luther was an anti-Semite. He was anti-Semitic. So a fair analysis of church history would see that Luther probably had a bias towards Jewish people. However, every time he wrote during this time period, when he talked about the Jews, it was exclusively discussing the religious movement and never the ethnic group. So that has to be understood, that Hitler was using what Luther was saying to justify saying God is on board with us wiping out the ethnic Jewish people. Martin Luther was very critical of the Jewish Judaism society, their system of religion, although he did later in life say, if I were Jewish and I were treated the way that most Christians treated me, I would have rather have been a dog than be a Christian. So a closer look at Luther shows that he was highly critical of Judaism, but in no way, shape, or form was actually anti-Semitic. Adolf Hitler took his words and twisted them because he was a great German figure. And he thought, and he was right, that people would get on board. So he died in 1546. He died of natural causes. That's still what we hold to be true to this day. He wrote a letter to his wife on the morning of his death at the age of 62. However, again, kind of a recent historical approach to Luther. Some modern German scholars have started to try to make the claim and to back it up that he committed suicide in an attempt to take the pleasure of killing himself away from the powers that be. So remember, he lived the last about 20, maybe closer to 30 years of his life, constantly thinking at any point the powers that be can come and kill me. By the grace of God, they never came. He wrote about it often. By the grace of God, I'm still here. By the grace of God, I'm still talking. I'm still writing. So there are some who, again, if you interact with people who write about Luther, there's a growing minority of people who believe that he killed himself because he thought they were closing in on him. But traditionally, we hold to the fact that he died from natural causes at the age of 62. So in 1546, he had passed away. Next week, we'll talk about his contemporary, which is Zwingli. And the following week, John Calvin, who took over from Zwingli, but overlapped Luther a little bit. So big points of importance about the second half of Martin Luther's life. He translated the Bible into the language of the people, which was vitally important. He championed personal Bible study. If you remember from the first lecture, he had never seen a physical Bible, never had an opportunity to read it until he was a college student. They didn't have them in the homes. They were in Latin. They were expensive. They were chained to the wall in the church. He wanted it to be accessible to the people. He saw what the printing press could do, the power it had. And so he is, if you are a person who really cherishes your daily devotions, Martin Luther is very formative in the reason in us having that, right? He was also a champion of demystifying the traditions of the church, including communion. He saw so many of the beliefs of the Catholic Church to be wrapped up in superstition, including many of the things that he held to be true earlier in life, like his encounter on the stormy road where the lightning bolt almost hit him and he thought for sure God was trying to kill him. Later in life, he said, clearly that was not what was happening here, but so much of superstition and folklore got mixed into the tradition of the church. And so he tried to peel back some of that. He spoke of the value of the individual's faith over and above their merit. We started to talk about that a little bit last week. He's probably most famously known for this idea of justification by faith alone. He was highly impactful on both Zwingli and Calvin, who would follow Zwingli. And so by extension, all Reformed theology is highly impacted by Martin Luther. And there are some scholars who use his sources to argue that he played a large role in the later development of democracy in Europe, that his idea of empowering the individual, of educating the individual, kind of stirring up the bottom class to rise up, which was kind of his dad's vision, but he did it in a completely different way, to make something of themselves through the church would eventually lead to democracy, which came in France. But so those are kind of the 5 main points. The second half of the life of Martin Luther, he was about personal Bible study, getting rid of folklore and kind of magic talk. He believed in faith of the individual over and above merit. He was highly influential in his conversations and his letters and in his writing of what was going on in Switzerland, which we'll spend the next 2 weeks talking about. And then some say that all of this that kind of happened propelled Europe towards democracy. So pretty big deal. Questions?